The great marshal had 99 sons, 99, and every single night he dreamed of a daughter. Just one. That was all he asked for. So he made a deal, the kind of deal only a man like him could make with the heavens. He announced openly, to anyone who would listen, that if the gods would bless him with a daughter, he would put down his blade. He would wash his hands of blood. He would give the world peace and stop the endless killing that had defined his name for decades. 10 months later, she arrived. A girl. His girl. He named her Nuo. And from that moment on, the most feared warlord in the entire empire of Dachi became something no battlefield had ever managed to make him. Completely, helplessly, irreversibly soft. Nuo was supposed to be, according to celestial legend, a small spirit nurtured by the heavens, now reborn as the only princess of Dachi. Not only did she immediately become the absolute center of her father, the great marshal's universe, but her very existence was said to carry a divine purpose, to help bring balance to the realm and bring peace to the four corners of the kingdom. The man who had once slaughtered enemies without blinking now couldn't bring himself to raise his voice if his daughter was within earshot. And remarkably, astonishingly, the moment she was born, the moment she drew her first breath, good news began arriving from every corner of the empire. Peace, prosperity, victories, as if the heavens themselves were keeping their side of the bargain. The first of those victories came swiftly. Word arrived that General Bai, the great marshal's finest commander, had returned triumphant from the Western Front and was approaching the city's southern gate. The great marshal immediately swept up little Nuo and marched out to welcome him personally. Nuo, bouncing happily in her father's arms, reached into her sleeve. She had a habit, even then, of hiding things in her sleeves, and pulled out her favorite candy. She had decided, in the serious and determined way only very small children can decide things, that she was going to give it to General Bai as a reward for winning the war. But before General Bai could even finish his formal greeting, Nuo had already wriggled free of her father's arms, landed on her tiny feet, and come toddling toward the general at full speed, waving one chubby hand enthusiastically. "Big brother Bai," she called out in her small, round voice. "It's been so long." General Bai, a man who had survived campaigns that broke hardened soldiers, took one look at this tiny princess barreling toward him and broke into the most completely genuine smile anyone had ever seen on his face. He immediately reported, however, that he had brought something back with him from the campaign, something apparently very dangerous. He advised the princess and the marshal to stand back. He pulled off a black cloth that had been draped over a large iron cage. Inside the cage was a boy, a teenager really, but with eyes that held the weight of something far older. His gaze was cold, calculating. He scanned the crowd with the precise, measuring attention of someone who had been trained from birth to assess threats and find exits. Nuo stared at him. Then her expression changed completely, from general-purpose toddler chaos to something that could only be described as starstruck. She announced, loudly and without hesitation, that he was a pretty big brother, and then she ran directly toward the cage. She reached the iron bars, held up a piece of candy toward the boy's face, and said with complete sincerity, "Pretty big brother, aren't you cold? Why are your feet bare?" The boy looked down at his own feet. Then he looked at Nuo's elaborate, warm clothing. He said nothing. Nuo was completely unbothered by the silence. She pressed on. "You must be hungry. My candy is very good. Eat it quickly." The great marshal, behind her, was already moving forward with alarm, reaching out, calling for her to come back. But the boy only slowly, carefully extended his hand through the bars. And instead of grabbing her, instead of doing anything threatening, he simply took the candy and ate it. He ate it like someone who hadn't had anything sweet in a very long time. Nuo watched him finish it, then immediately pulled out another piece. She had an inexhaustible supply somewhere in those sleeves, but before she could offer it, chaos erupted. One of the other prisoners, being held in separate restraints behind them, had managed to break free of his chains. He came charging at full speed, straight toward Nuo, blade raised. The great marshal's warriors were moving, but the distance was wrong. Too far, too slow. The blade was going to reach her, and then it didn't. The boy in the cage shot his arm through the bars and shoved Nuo sideways, knocking her out of the blade's path. She hit the ground. The weapon passed through empty air where she had been standing a half-second earlier. And in the same motion, before anyone else could react, the boy's other hand shot out through the opposite side of the cage and caught the attacker's wrist. The prisoner froze. The boy's red eyes, cold, ancient, laced with something that made even trained soldiers take a step back, fixed on the man with an expression that communicated one thing with absolute precision. You have made a terrible mistake. There was a sound, a crack. The attacker's grip was broken. He was thrown aside like something weightless. Nuo, who had landed on her bottom in the dirt, squeezed her eyes shut during the violence. Then, unable to help herself, she opened one eye to peek. The boy stood in the cage, still and composed, as if he had not just demonstrated something extraordinary. The great marshal arrived at Nuo's side, swept her up, and held her close, his voice shaking slightly beneath its usual thunder. "Nuo, don't be scared, Papa's here." He ordered the group of prisoners taken away for punishment. Nuo immediately objected, loudly, "Papa, no killing. Make them scrub the dirtiest latrines." The prisoners, elite warriors who had survived real battlefields, collectively expressed what appeared to be genuine outrage at the concept of latrine duty being considered a worse fate than execution. But the great marshal, as always when his daughter had an opinion, simply did as she asked. Then he turned and looked at the boy in the cage. He asked General Bai how a child like this had come to be there, and what exactly he could do. The general explained that there were rumors about an enemy nation that trained its deadliest warriors by placing children in environments with wolves, actual wolves, forcing the survivors to develop abilities beyond normal human limits. This boy had been found during the capture of an enemy outpost. He might be the wolf king they'd heard about, the one who would someday command their entire wolf force. The great marshal was deliberating on what to do with him when Nuo, still perched in his arms, grabbed his collar and looked up at him with enormous, earnest eyes, and announced that the pretty big brother had saved her life, and that if Papa didn't let him out of the cage, she would stop talking to Papa forever. The great marshal, conqueror of nations, terror of battlefields, man whose name made opposing armies break formation and run, lasted about 4 seconds before he gave the order to open the cage. The iron door swung open. The boy walked out slowly, barefoot on the cold ground, and looked around at the ring of warriors surrounding him. His gaze passed over all of them and settled on Nuo. Nuo waved both hands at him, beaming. "Pretty big brother," she announced. "Tomorrow I'll give you candy every day." The great marshal, having released this wild teenager into his household, assigned him to General Bai's supervision. General Bai was responsible for him. If he harmed anyone, the general would share the punishment. Then the marshal carried Nuo away. She twisted in his arms and called back over his shoulder that the pretty big brother needed shoes. The boy stood there watching the small, cheerful figure being carried off. A tiny, involuntary smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and disappeared just as quickly. General Bai asked him his name. The boy looked away and said, in a tone that indicated he was done entertaining questions, "Father gave me the name." Then he walked away on his own. General Bai stared after him. His name, it turned out, was Ye Si Ming. On Nuo's 3rd birthday, while everyone was busy with preparations, she slipped away to the lake. She had spotted, from a distance, 2 older girls who were tormenting a small cat, dangling it over the water, threatening to drop it in. Nuo watched this from behind a tree, assessed the situation, and quietly activated a gift she'd been born with. A power over natural forces that she had not told many people about, because grown-ups got very alarmed when they saw it. A column of water surged up from the lake's surface directly in front of the 2 girls. Both of them screamed and ran. The cat sat alone on the ground, shaking. Nuo emerged from behind her tree, approached carefully, and reached out her small round hand to comfort the frightened creature. The cat, whose survival instincts had been honed by the immediate preceding trauma, immediately leaped sideways and scrambled up the nearest tree. Nuo looked up at it. She looked at the tree. She was 3 years old and had no concept of the word impossible, so she climbed after it. The cat moved further out onto a branch. Nuo followed. She was nearly close enough to touch it when the branch made a sound that was the sound of too much weight in the wrong place, and then it gave way entirely, and Nuo entered the air with the surprised expression of someone whose plan had just developed a significant flaw. She did not hit the water. Arms caught her from below, sure and steady, and she looked up to find herself looking at a face she recognized. Ye Si Ming. He was taller now, sharper in the jaw, even more striking than the frozen-eyed boy in the cage had been. A year and a half had changed him considerably. Nuo's first thought, before any other, was that he was even more handsome than she remembered. She immediately produced a piece of candy from somewhere. She always had candy, and held it up to him in gratitude. Thanks for saving Nuo. Then she pointed at the cat, still in the tree above them, and asked with complete confidence whether he could please also save it. He looked at the cat. He looked at her. He sighed. He said, "Troublesome." But he got the cat down. He handed it to Nuo. One hand for the candy, one hand for the cat. Nuo accepted both, looked up at him thoughtfully, and watched him put the candy in his mouth. Same taste as last time, she observed. Ye Si Ming was about to respond when Nuo leaned up, rising on her tiptoes, and reached for his head. He stood very still, confused, while she stretched her small arms as high as they'd go and tugged the small ornament from his hair. She held it in her hands. He stared at it. In his months at General Bai's household, he had been treated well, treated like a son, practically, but his nature was too closed for the warmth to reach him easily. The general had asked him to learn to be more approachable. He had tried. This small person before him, somehow, was the only one who made the effort feel natural rather than performed. He met her eyes and said, deliberately and seriously, "My name is Ye Si Ming." Nuo beamed. "Okay, Si Ming, big brother." Then she bounced away on her short legs, waving cheerfully without looking back. Ye Si Ming stood holding the little ornament she'd taken from him, then placed it in his palm and closed his fingers around it and held it against his chest. Something at the corner of his mouth moved again. The general, watching from a distance, thought, "This boy is already completely done for, and he doesn't even know it yet." Nuo was 3 years old when she decided she wanted a pet. She had already decided what kind. She announced at breakfast in front of her mother consort Chao and her maid Wan Yin that she wanted a kitten. Wan Yin gently explained that what the princess had in her arms was not a kitten. It was a small white tiger that the animal keeper had received that morning from the imperial menagerie. Nuo covered her ears and announced that she wasn't listening. It was a kitten, and that was final. This was the state of affairs when the great marshal arrived and heard his daughter's loud declaration. He scooped her up, dried her eyes. She had deployed tears at some point in the negotiation, a tactic she used with devastating effectiveness, and said simply, "You want to keep it? Then keep it. Papa says yes." Consort Qiao watched the two of them go off together and let out a long, resigned breath. She had forgotten somehow, despite abundant evidence, that the great marshal feared nothing on earth except his daughter's tears. It was at Nuo's birthday banquet that things took a darker turn. The table was covered in gifts. The room was bright and full. Nuo scanned the assembled guests with the casual curiosity of a well-loved child, and stopped. In the crowd she saw something no one else could see. A dark miasma, coiling and heavy, rising off one of the serving women. Something is bad, Nuo thought. She slid off her chair and moved through the crowd on her small legs until she was standing in front of the woman. She pointed directly at her and said, in her most serious voice, "Bad thing." The woman's composure cracked instantly. She told the child to stay back, her voice rising, and announced that she had poison. Poison that could kill a princess in moments. The room went very still. The great marshal, who had been moving the moment he saw his daughter approach the stranger, was now in the awful position of negotiating with someone holding his most precious person hostage. He asked what she wanted. She said she wanted the marshal's life. And while they talked, while everyone's attention was fixed on the standoff, Nuo quietly did what Nuo always did. She assessed the situation, identified her options, and chose the most direct one available. Her power moved before any adult could stop her. The vials of poison in the woman's hands shattered. The contents dispersed in a cloud that turned back on the woman herself. She collapsed. Wan Yin threw herself forward and shielded Nuo with her own body. The great marshal crossed the room at a speed that defied his size, swept Nuo into his arms, and held her with a grip that could have bent iron. When the room was cleared and everyone had confirmed that Nuo was safe, she looked up at her father's drawn face and said with perfect calm, "It's all over now." Nuo protected Papa and Mama. The court erupted. Stories had been circulating since Nuo's birth that the princess was divinely gifted, born under auspicious stars, carrying heaven's blessing in her tiny hands. After that day, no one whispered about it anymore. They said it openly, without reservation. This child was no ordinary child. The great marshal, holding his daughter tight, said into her hair, in a voice that was nothing at all like his battlefield voice, exactly that. He announced that as of her 3rd birthday, Nuo would receive a formal celestial name, the name Yao Guang. The words meant, the one who illuminates 10,000 things. Nuo, who did not understand the ceremony but trusted completely that anything her father chose was good, waved her hands enthusiastically and said she loved it. The great marshal laughed, a real full laugh, and declared that everyone present would receive a reward. The assembled court erupted in praise. Of all the people in that room, the two most composed were General Bai and Ye Si Ming. The general had seen enough of this family to not be surprised by anything. And Ye Si Ming watched the small figure being celebrated at the center of all that joy and thought, without quite meaning to, Yao Guang. What an impossible name to ignore. One morning Nuo was deep in a dream involving large quantities of food when a bright, sharp sound yanked her out of it. She wandered into the corridor half awake and overheard two maids whispering. The Empress was ill, seriously ill. Nuo immediately went to find her mother and asked to visit the Empress. Consort Qiao was hesitant. If Nuo caught the Empress's illness and the Emperor found out she'd brought the child, there would be consequences. But Nuo had never quite grasped the concept of no when the person saying it was someone she loved, and the reason was something she felt could be overcome, and so she looked at her mother with enormous, imploring eyes, and her mother made the decision that every parent of a truly determined child eventually makes. She agreed, and they would simply not tell the Emperor. The Empress, when they arrived, scolded Consort Qiao for bringing the princess. What if she caught the illness? Nuo stood at the Empress's bedside and announced serenely that Nuo would not get sick. Then she took the Empress's hand, closed her eyes, and concentrated. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. She simply did it. Pushed warmth through her small fingers and into the older woman's hands and willed with everything in her for the sickness to ease. When she opened her eyes, the Empress was breathing differently, not perfectly, not cured, but lighter. The Empress stared at her and said she felt a little better. She said she wished she had a daughter like Nuo. She said the child must be made of something different than ordinary people. While the Empress and Consort Qiao were talking, Nuo's sharp eyes caught movement through the curtain. A palace servant was doing something near the Empress's tea tray, something quick and furtive, with the particular speed of someone who knows they shouldn't be seen. Nuo came back to her mother's side and reported what she'd seen in a low, urgent whisper. Consort Qiao's expression changed immediately. She told Wan Yin to take Nuo to the menagerie. She herself had things to handle. Nuo didn't want to go to the menagerie. She wanted to stay with her mother. Wan Yin, explaining things the way you explain them to a very smart child who is also very stubborn, told her that the consort and the Empress were old friends, had been for years, and that if someone was threatening the Empress, her mother would not simply stand aside. Nuo processed this. Then she decided the menagerie was acceptable, but she needed to find her father first and tell him what was happening. She set off at a run, Wan Yin following. Outside the Emperor's study, Nuo sat down on the ground and began to cry, loudly. The door opened within seconds. The Emperor appeared, having cleared the room of ministers with a single gesture at the first sound of his daughter's voice, and crouched down in front of her. "Little monster, what happened?" Nuo threw her arms out and wailed that someone bad was hurting Nuo and Mama. The emperor picked her up, settled her against his chest, and his expression became something that was very different from the face he showed his court. She told him everything, what she'd seen, who was involved, where her mother was now. The emperor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said quietly to Wan Yin, "Tell me everything, in detail." Wan Yin described the scene. The emperor's face went through several changes and arrived somewhere very cold. He said, "Tell the consort she does not need to investigate. The perpetrator should be executed directly." Nuo objected immediately, gripping his collar. "Papa, wait." That servant moved fast. She must have practiced. This probably isn't the first time. The emperor paused. He looked at his 3-year-old daughter, who had just advised him to approach a poisoning case with investigative patience rather than immediate execution. He decided she was right. He told her to go with Wan Yin. He would handle this personally. The servant, when confronted by consort Chao, who had cornered her with evidence before the emperor arrived, tried to shift the blame. She knelt and wept and claimed the consort herself had ordered her to poison the Empress's tea, that she had been coerced, that she was terrified, and had no choice. She painted the consort as a villain hiding behind a mask of friendship. It was a desperate gamble, and it did not work. The emperor, who arrived while this performance was still in progress, pointed out that his daughter, 3 years old, barely reaching anyone's waist, had identified the perpetrator before any adult in the palace had noticed anything wrong. He trusted his daughter's assessment. He told the consort, "The prisoner won't talk willingly. Prepare a reckoning. Gather everyone in the rear palace." He wanted to see whose expression was wrong. He trusted his consort to handle the details. Nuo, reunited with Wan Yin, arrived at the imperial menagerie to find the animals, particularly a newly arrived black bear, in a state of visible agitation. The bear was pacing and growling and rolling its head in a way that made the handlers nervous. Ye Si Ming was there. General Bai had brought him to demonstrate his unusual ability to communicate with large predators. Nuo arrived and immediately sensed something. She tugged Ye Si Ming's sleeve and told him the bear was in pain. Something was stuck in its neck, something it couldn't get out. Ye Si Ming looked at her. This was the thing about Nuo. She had told him about her gifts very carefully and very selectively, the way children tell their most trusted people's secrets, and he had never doubted a single word of it. He asked for the handling tools, told the handlers he was going in, and did not wait for arguments. He walked into the cage alone, approached the bear, and spoke to it, not in a way that any normal person would speak to a large predatory animal, but in a way that communicated something the bear apparently understood, because the creature stopped pacing and lay down. Nuo, outside the cage, pressed her hands together and wished very hard for his safety. Ye Si Ming examined the bear's neck, found a broken arrowhead buried deep in the muscle, and pulled it out in one motion. The bear bellowed. Then it was quiet. And then it behaved, as Nuo later described it, like a very large puppy. When Ye Si Ming came back out, Nuo beckoned him down to her level and indicated she had a secret to share. He lowered himself to her height, curious. She put her mouth near his ear, and he waited, genuinely wondering what she was going to reveal. And instead, with one smooth movement, she grabbed the loose end of his hair and patted it fondly. Ye Si Ming's face went pink. Not much, barely visible, but Nuo saw it, and she filed it away in the category of things she found delightful. He stood back up. Wan Yin, who had been watching from a safe distance, was fairly certain she witnessed the wolf king of a foreign enemy nation get flustered by a 3-year-old's hair ruffling. She decided not to mention this to anyone. Later, however, she did confide to a trusted colleague that young Ye Si Ming was, in her professional opinion, already in serious trouble. Something had been moving in the shadows that day near the menagerie. A figure, partially concealed, watching Nuo from a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. Ye Si Ming had caught the movement at the edge of his vision and traced it back, a brief silhouette behind a pillar, gone before he could identify it. He pulled Wan Yin aside and warned her someone was watching the princess. The kind of watching that was not casual curiosity. Nuo was at risk. He would escort them back himself. Wan Yin, who had been frightened since the tea poisoning incident and was not above admitting it, agreed immediately. The three of them arrived at the princess's wing to find it surrounded by imperial guards. The emperor had already deployed protection, acting on Nuo's warning earlier. Ye Si Ming saw the guards and considered his escort responsibility technically complete. He said goodbye to Nuo and turned to go. She waved after him with both hands. Bye-bye. Then she ran inside to find her mother and ask whether the Empress was all right. Consort Chao hugged her and told her yes. The Empress was safe. The perpetrator had been dealt with. But this had been a very near thing, and until further notice, Nuo was not to go anywhere alone. The servant who had administered the poison had died before revealing who had given the order. But her last words, gasped before she lost consciousness, had been two names, the consort's and Nuo's. It had the feeling of a message being delivered, not a revelation, but a threat. Someone had targeted them specifically, someone who knew exactly which two people in the palace were connected in a way that made them both vulnerable. Consort Chao, rocking her daughter in the dark of her chamber that night, thought carefully about who wanted them both gone. The list was not short, but whoever was at the top of it had just learned something important. This particular 3-year-old was not as easy to threaten as they had assumed. 3 nights later, in the deep cold of the early hours, Nuo woke to find the window open. She sat up in the dark, groggy, feeling the chill on her face, and got up to close it. She was halfway across the room when her gift triggered on its own, not deliberately, but the way a reflex works, without permission, and she threw herself sideways just as something very fast passed through the air where she'd been standing. A dart. Consort Chao's voice rang out in the dark, sharp, commanding, furious, and then the sound of movement, and then the sound of things going wrong for whoever had sent the dart. Nuo had rolled under the heavy writing table and wrapped her arms around her knees and opened her eyes as wide as they would go. She was watching. She could see her mother moving through the shadows like she'd been born there. The legendary Chao family sword technique, passed down through generations, worth every story ever told about it. The black-clad intruder, who had come expecting an ordinary mother and daughter in a sleeping palace, discovered very quickly that he had made a serious miscalculation. Within minutes, he was on the floor. Consort Chao stepped over him and asked, in a voice that was perfectly level, "Who sent you?" The intruder stared up at her with the expression of someone who had decided to be defiant. From under the table, Nuo's small voice emerged. "Mr. in Black, Nuo will pay double the price for your information." There was a pause. Consort Chao looked at her daughter. She had no idea where the child had picked up negotiation tactics. The intruder, despite himself, let his eyes flick toward the princess with something that might have been reluctant admiration. He said he had professional standards. He didn't sell out employers. Nuo pointed out, with impeccable logic, "Then I won't buy your information. I'll just have someone go stab you." The intruder's defiant expression wavered. He looked between the mother, who was standing calmly above him with a sword and zero hesitation in her eyes, and the daughter, who was suggesting assassination with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. He thought about his options. Consort Chao added, "I could take you to the emperor. Even if you don't say a word, he will not simply release you. My daughter has already told you the only way you walk away from this room." The intruder was silent for a long moment. Then he did a single, precise roll upright and said, "Your lives are worth no less than 2,000 taels." And then he was gone through the window like smoke. Wan Yin, who had arrived at the sound of the commotion, was sent immediately to track him. Before long, with her help, the true mastermind was identified, and the emperor was informed. By morning, the threat had been dealt with. Nuo, informed that the danger had passed, went back to sleep immediately. Consort Chao stood over her sleeping daughter and breathed out slowly. She thought, The child who was supposed to only need protecting had, again, saved them both. Nuo had spotted the poisoner at the banquet. Nuo had warned the emperor in time. Nuo had negotiated with an assassin. Nuo was 3 years old. Consort Chao pulled the blanket up to her daughter's chin and thought that the heavens, in their infinite creativity, had sent them something entirely unprecedented. The next morning brought news that Nuo's grandmother, a formidable figure who had been conspicuously absent from Nuo's life thus far, would be arriving to visit. Nuo, upon hearing this, performed an extremely skilled impression of being deeply asleep, complete with soft, theatrical snoring. The adults in the room were aware she was faking. Nuo waited until the room was empty, then sat up, confirmed her solitude, changed her own clothes at impressive speed, left a short note on the desk, and climbed out the window. She was going to find Ye Si Ming. He would protect her. She had left a very clear note saying exactly this, so that no one would worry. It said, "Going to find Si Ming, brother. He will keep me safe. Don't scold Wan Yin's sister." The note was, by any measure, extremely well-reasoned for someone who had just defenestrated herself to avoid a family visit. White General Bai, who discovered Nuo in his courtyard sometime later, brought her inside and had to explain to his wife why the imperial princess had shown up at their door. Nuo, meanwhile, was searching every room for Ye Si Ming and not finding him. She finally asked the general's wife, "Bai auntie, where's Si Ming, big brother? Nuo wants to find him." The general's wife looked concerned. Ye Si Ming's schedule, she explained, was not like other people's. He tended to sleep through the day and move at night, a habit ingrained from years of training. At this hour, he was certainly still sleeping. Nuo announced that she would wake him up. She was directed to the courtyard opposite his room, separated by a covered walkway that was currently in the rain. She stood at the edge of the walkway, considered the rain, and decided on an alternative approach. She cupped her hands around her mouth and bellowed, "Si Ming, big brother, come out and see Nuo." The silence that followed was complete. Nuo tried again, and again, and again. Her small voice rang across the courtyard in steady, relentless intervals. Then a door slammed open. Ye Si Ming appeared in the doorway with his hair loose around his face, sleep still heavy in his expression, and fixed his gaze across the rain and the walkway at the small figure responsible for the noise. He said one word. It was not a polite word. Nuo waved. Ye Si Ming stood in his doorway for a moment, looking at her. Then he stepped off the porch, walked straight through the rain, and caught her just as she tripped on the slippery edge of the walkway and started to fall. He held her in the air and looked at her. She looked back at him. He carried her, dripping and satisfied, under the shelter of his room's eave. He asked what she wanted. She told him she was hungry. He asked what she wanted to eat. She thought for a moment, then said, "Mama's milk." Ye Si Ming put her down and took one large step backward. He stared at her. Nuo found the expression on his face very funny. He walked back into his room, picked up a stone from the training yard and threw it at a nearby tree. A sparrow fell to the ground. He built a small fire and roasted it. Nuo looked at the sparrow and said, "It's so cute. How can you eat a sparrow?" Within minutes she had reconsidered, because the smell was extraordinary, and Ye Si Ming fed pieces to her without saying a word, and she ate with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child who has decided that the situation has changed. At the end of it, she looked up and told him he was the best big brother in the world. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother is coming to see you." Nuo's face fell. She had forgotten. Ye Si Ming looked at her expression and said nothing, but moved to sit beside her on the step, their shoulders almost touching in the cold morning air. It was the night of the full moon when the next real threat arrived. Nuo was asleep when her power woke her. Not a window left open this time, but something in the quality of the air itself. She lay still and listened. Shadows moved on the curtain, 3 of them, outside. Nuo slipped out of bed, crept to the wall, and pressed herself against it. Through the gap in the curtain she counted 3 black-clad figures, moving in perfect coordination. They were very good. they were also coming for her specifically. What they had not calculated was that the Princess of Daxi was not in her bed, was not crying, and was not running. She was standing very quietly by the wall, gathering her gift around her the way you gather a breath before diving into deep water, and waiting. The moment the first figure came through the window, she released it. The force of it wasn't violence, it was more like a wall of air, sudden and overwhelming, that threw all three of them backwards simultaneously. They landed badly. By the time they recovered, the room's lamps had come alive and Consort Chow was there, and then the guards, and it was over much faster than it should have been for three supposedly elite infiltrators. One of them, when questioned later, said in a shaking voice that the child had done something impossible, that no human being, let alone a small girl, should have been able to project that kind of force. The report reached the emperor by morning. He read it twice, had it burned, and said only, "I know." He had known since the day of the banquet. He had been waiting for others to figure it out on their own. Life settled again, the way it always does after a crisis, in ways that make the previous calm feel like it was never fully appreciated. Nuo went back to her days of running through palace corridors with a small white tiger on her heels, hiding candy in every possible pocket and sleeve, dragging Ye Si Ming out of sleep to escort her to places she wanted to see. She discovered that her second brother, the second prince, Gu Zitong, had a wonderful talent for finding her wherever she had gone and arriving with outlandish gifts and an energy that matched hers in the best possible way. He showed up one afternoon with a blood jade hairpin worth 10,000 gold pieces and absolutely no apology for the extravagance. Consort Xiao said he shouldn't keep spoiling his little sister. He said his little sister deserved the best thing in the entire world, and this was simply what that looked like today. Consort Xiao sighed the sigh of a woman outnumbered by people who would give Nuo anything she pointed at. She asked where his mother was. The second prince's expression changed. He left. Immediately. Without a word. Consort Xiao understood. The matter of his arranged marriage had been raised again. She made a mental note to be kind about it later. She found him at the cold storage pond, digging in the mud with a stick, muttering. Nuo crouched beside him and watched for a while, then asked him why he always ran away when someone mentioned his mother. He explained, at length, and with considerable feeling, that his mother had an unfortunate habit of pressing him to finalize his marriage, had confiscated his spending money as leverage, and had managed to drain various savings, pocket money, and secret funds in her campaign. The cold pond was where he had buried his last reserve, enough for 100,000 taels, in a sealed waterproof case. He had come to check on it. He retrieved the case with ceremony. He and Nuo bent over it together, full of anticipation. He opened it. It was empty. The second prince stared into the empty case. He made a sound that was less a word and more a pure expression of betrayal. His savings, gone. Every coin. Nuo peered into the case and noticed something. A faint trace of smell, and a faint crease where someone had been, recently, very close to this spot. "Big brother," she said carefully. "There might be someone in the cold storage." The second prince's eyes went wide. He grabbed Nuo's arm and said, "I knew it. Mother always said the cold pond was haunted. I knew she wasn't lying." Nuo didn't believe in ghosts. She opened the cold storage door. The third prince was inside, looking deeply uncomfortable and slightly damp. The second prince stared at him. Then he said, with the deadly calm of someone who has been robbed by family, "So it was you who took the money." The third prince straightened, arranged his dignity as best he could in the circumstances, and said he had come to return the money today anyway. He had simply come a day early, discovered the hiding place accidentally, and borrowed what he needed for a medical emergency. He had brought it back today. He was putting it in the box as he spoke. The second prince calculated whether he was still owed an apology. Nuo intervened before war broke out, pointing out that the third brother obviously wasn't going to steal forever, and had come back to make it right, and the second brother's money was intact, and what was everyone actually upset about? She asked the third prince what the medical emergency had been. He told her, medicine called Ku Gu Hua. It grew in damp, cold places and was the only treatment for certain battlefield wounds. He had a regiment of soldiers in the field who were bleeding out because their supply had run out. He had used the second prince's money to replace it. Nuo looked at him for a moment. Then she told the second brother, "Take me to the army camp. I want to help." She needed to find Ye Si Ming first, though. She always needed to find Ye Si Ming first. At General Bai's residence, Ye Si Ming was in a poor mood because he had no money to buy no sweets and was too proud to ask the general directly. He had come up with a solution. He would perform in the courtyard by breaking a stone block bare-handed and earn a small amount that way. General Bai, who came out to watch, was deeply amused by this plan. He told Ye Si Ming, "Next time, just ask me." He had resources. But since the young man was here and dressed for it, why not make it interesting? They would spar, and if Ye Si Ming won, the general would give him double what he needed. Ye Si Ming hesitated because his actual concern was accidentally hurting the general, who outranked him and who he respected. The general laughed and said not to worry about him. They sparred. Ye Si Ming won, efficiently. The general stood up from where he'd landed. He had landed on the ground, which was not where he'd planned to be, and said thoughtfully that he was clearly still very good and that young man was clearly better. He paid up without complaint. Nuo, who had arrived during the sparring and watched the whole thing from the doorway with shining eyes, ran up to the general and patted his back consolingly. "He'll be fine in a moment," she told Ye Si Ming, as if the general hadn't just been thoroughly defeated by his own ward. Then she grabbed Ye Si Ming's sleeve and told him she needed him to come with her. He came. He always came when Nuo asked. He thought of reasons not to sometimes, and then he came anyway. At the army camp, the scene was worse than Nuo expected. Soldiers lay on cots with wounds that had stopped clotting, their faces pale, their breathing shallow. The medicine that should have been there, the medicine the third prince had confirmed was sent yesterday, was nowhere. The unit commander, speaking in a voice carefully controlled to not show how frightened he was, explained. The previous medicine delivery had been redirected. A senior officer named Guo Bu Huan, who was technically their commanding general, had taken the supplies and diverted them for his own use. Entertainment, parties, personal gain. Reports had been filed with the imperial administration multiple times. All of them had been quietly buried before reaching anyone with the authority to act. Nuo looked at the wounded men. She looked at the third prince, who was searching a reference list of medicinal plants and finding no easy replacement. She looked at Ye Si Ming, who stood just behind her right shoulder, as he always did. She said, "If we can't find what we need on the ground, I know where else to look." She told Ye Si Ming to stand guard. She was going to sleep, right here, in the middle of the army camp. He looked at her. She pointed to a relatively clean empty cot and said, "Please make sure no one disturbs me." Ye Si Ming, who had by now learned not to question her on things like this, positioned himself beside the cot and waited. The second prince, who had no frame of reference for what was happening, attempted twice to intervene and was firmly stopped by Ye Si Ming both times. Nuo closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. Her expression went somewhere else entirely, not unconscious, not dreaming in any normal sense, but somewhere else, somewhere very far up and very clear, and she came back with a list, a complete, specific, verifiable list of plants available in the immediate terrain that, when prepared correctly, would accomplish what the missing medicine was supposed to do. She sat up, handed the third prince the list, and said simply, "Start gathering." The third prince stared at it. He was a physician. He recognized what she had written. He had no explanation for how she knew it, and he didn't ask. He started gathering. They were nearly finished organizing the collection when Guo Bu Huan came back from wherever he'd been, from the smell of him, from wine, and walked directly into the situation. He saw the princes, he saw the princess, he saw the soldiers moving with purpose under orders from people who were not him. He announced that the soldiers had been loafing, that this was a military installation, and that their punishment for disorder in the camp would be 100 strikes apiece. Nuo's face went very still. She stood up. The second prince, who was furious, said he would take this to the emperor. Guo Bu Huan said, "With what evidence?" The medicine was used by 6 soldiers. It was authorized. As for the punishment, he was the commanding general. He had the authority. He took a long drink from the flask he was carrying, wiped his mouth, and said that soldiers were replaceable. The weak ones should be discarded, not coddled. He turned and walked away. Nuo watched him go. She thought about all the soldiers on those cots. She thought about the medicine that had been stolen from them and spent on wine. She made a decision. She looked at Ye Si Ming. He looked back at her. He nodded before she said a word. She reached into her sleeve and found what she needed, and she began to plan. Guo Bu Huan would not be walking away from this, not with a princess of Da Qi standing in the middle of the camp he had just desecrated, and not with Ye Si Ming already moving through the crowd toward the exit Guo Bu Huan had taken, closing the distance with the particular silent efficiency of someone who had been trained to be the last thing you saw before you ran out of time. The soldiers on the cots didn't know what was coming, but they were going to be all right, because Nuo had decided they were going to be all right. And in Dachi, in that year, in that extraordinary season of peace that had begun the moment she drew her first breath, when Yao Guang decided something, the heavens had a way of agreeing. Guo Bu Huan did not make it far. Ye Si Ming had moved through the camp the way he moved through everything, without hurry, without announcement, with an efficiency that made it look almost casual right up until the moment it was very much not casual. He came around the side of the storage building just as Guo Bu Huan was handing his flask to a subordinate and beginning to enjoy what he thought was a satisfying exit from a confrontation he had won. He had not won anything. Ye Si Ming stepped into his path and stopped there. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at the man, the same way he had looked at the black bear in the cage, with the complete, unruffled assessment of something that did not feel threatened and had no need to perform. Guo Bu Huan's first instinct was to bluster. He said, "Who are you to block my path?" Ye Si Ming said, "I'm asking you one question. Where is the medicine?" Guo Bu Huan laughed. He said this was a military camp and he was a general, and children, the word dripped with contempt, did not give him questions. He turned to his subordinates and told them to remove this person. 3 of them moved. None of them completed the motion. The speed with which they found themselves on the ground was the kind of speed that does not register as movement so much as a change in the position of objects. Guo Bu Huan stared at his 3 men on the dirt. He looked back at Ye Si Ming. Ye Si Ming had not moved from where he was standing. He said, "One more time, where is the medicine?" The flask hit the ground. Guo Bu Huan's hand went to his sword, which was a decision he had very limited time to regret. The sword was taken. The man himself was on his knees. Ye Si Ming held the confiscated weapon loosely and said nothing, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. When the second prince and the third prince arrived at the scene, having followed the sounds of brief, decisive violence, they found Guo Bu Huan kneeling in the dirt, making the calculations that people make when they understand the situation has changed fundamentally. Ye Si Ming handed the sword to the second prince without ceremony. The second prince took it and looked down at Guo Bu Huan and felt, for perhaps the first time in this whole long afternoon, entirely satisfied. The third prince was already composing the formal report in his head. The soldiers who had been watching from a cautious distance began to move again, purposefully, now, gathering the materials for the medicine Nuo had identified, working with the energy of people who believe that the situation is going to resolve in their favor. Nuo herself appeared from around the other corner of the storage building, having arrived from a completely different direction, and looked at the tableau in front of her with an expression of serene approval. She said, "Did anyone get hurt?" Ye Si Ming said, "No." She said, "Good." She looked at Guo Bu Huan. He looked back at her, this small, composed figure with the enormous dark eyes and the absolute calm of someone who had faced actual assassins and not flinched. And something in his expression shifted from belligerence to something closer to the beginning of genuine fear. She said, "You took medicine from soldiers who were bleeding. You'll give an account of that to the emperor, not to me. I'm just a little girl. He can decide what happens next." She turned and walked away. Ye Si Ming followed. The second and third princes followed him. Guo Buhuan remained kneeling in the dirt behind them, suddenly very aware that 3 imperial children and what appeared to be a one-man military force had just documented everything that happened today and were on their way to the palace. The report reached the emperor before the sun set. He read it without expression. He asked 3 questions, received 3 answers, and then sat very quietly for a moment. His daughter was in the camp. His daughter had identified a substitute medicine from an empty room by sleeping on a cot, and somehow knowing things that took trained physicians years to learn. His daughter had stood in the middle of a corrupt general's domain, and told that general, without raising her voice, without any show of force beyond the force of her own absolute composure, that he would face the emperor's judgment. And then she had walked away. He set the report down. He told the official who had delivered it, "Handle Guo Buhuan according to the law. Full accounting. No protection for his rank or his family connections." The official bowed and left. The emperor sat alone in the lamplit study and thought about his daughter. He thought about the night she was born, and what the astrologers had said, and how he had listened politely and not believed most of it. He thought about the birthday banquet. He thought about Wan Yin's reports, and the Empress's improved breathing after a single visit, and the shattered poison vials, and the 3 assassins knocked flat by a force that had no source anyone could identify. He thought about the list of medicinal plants written in a child's careful brush strokes that his court physician had confirmed was not only accurate but was, in his professional estimation, a more elegant solution than the conventional one. The emperor, who believed in evidence over superstition, concluded that the evidence in this particular case was fairly conclusive. He picked up his brush and wrote a single line. It was an amendment to the Yao Guang proclamation from Nuo's birthday. The amendment was short. It said only, "The princess is to be given whatever resources she requires, without condition and without delay. Anyone who impedes her is to be treated as an enemy of the throne." He let the ink dry. He folded it and sealed it. He sent it to the consort's chambers. Consort Qiao read it before bed, alone, and held it for a long moment. Then she looked at her daughter, sleeping with her small fist against her cheek, and her white tiger curled at her feet, and she thought, "You have no idea, my darling, what you are." And she thought, "I hope the world is ready for you." And she thought, "I hope you are never, ever afraid." 2 days later, something happened that Nuo found significantly more alarming than assassins. She came back from the menagerie to find 2 women in her mother's sitting room who were dressed in the specific way of people who have come to evaluate rather than visit. And she overheard the word suitable, and then the word age, and then the phrase "it really is time to begin considering matches." She stood in the doorway and processed this. The women were talking about Ye Si Ming. They said he was of an age where the question of his future should be settled. He was established, capable, housed comfortably in the general's residence, but as a young man with no family name to speak of, no lineage, and origins that were, to put it diplomatically, complicated, there were concerns about his long-term suitability as anything except a servant of the state. They were suggesting that his placement should be formalized into something permanent and clearly defined, that the ambiguity of his current situation should be resolved. Nuo heard the word formalized. She heard the word placement. She was not entirely clear on all the specifics of what she was listening to, but she understood enough to recognize that the women in her mother's sitting room were planning something about Ye Si Ming that Ye Si Ming had not agreed to, and had probably not been asked about. She stepped into the room. Both women looked at her. Consort Qiao looked at her. Nuo said, in the specific polite tone she used when she was being very careful, "May I ask what Big Brother Si Ming thinks about this?" The women exchanged a glance. One of them said gently that at his age and with his background, what he thought wasn't quite the primary consideration. It was what was best for him given his circumstances. Nuo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, still politely, "I see. She asked her mother if she could have a snack. Consort Xiao, who knew her daughter, felt a small premonition. She said of course. Nuo thanked the women graciously for their visit and went to find Wan Yin. She told Wan Yin she needed to go see Ye Si Ming immediately. It was important. Wan Yin asked, "Is it actually important, or is it important like the time you decided the cat situation was important?" Nuo said, "Both, probably." Wan Yin put on her outer robe. Ye Si Ming was in the general's courtyard going through practice forms alone when Nuo arrived at a run, slightly out of breath, and planted herself in front of him. He stopped. He looked at her. Her expression was the specific expression that meant she was processing something complicated and had come to him because he was the person she processed things with. He waited. She said, "There are people who want to decide things about you, without asking you." He said, "What kind of things?" She said, "Future things. Where you go, what you do, who you—" She paused. "Who you're connected to." He was very still. He said, "When?" She said, "Now. They're in Mama's sitting room now." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "And what do you want to do about it?" Nuo pulled herself up to her full height, which was not very full, but she made it count. She said, "I want to tell them that Big Brother Si Ming is already decided. That he already has a place. That it's here. And that it's with me." Ye Si Ming looked at her face, completely serious, completely certain, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been told that there were things she wasn't allowed to want, and felt something happen in his chest that he had no name for yet. He was 15 years old, she was 3, almost 4. The gap between those numbers was enormous, and the future was far away, and everything between now and then was uncertain. But she was standing in the general's courtyard in the late afternoon light looking at him like the decision was already made and simply needed announcing, and he thought, yes, this is where I am, this is where I will stay. He said, "Then go tell them." She said, "Come with me." He came with her. They walked into her mother's sitting room together, a small princess and a barefoot teenager from a foreign country with red eyes that had seen things that could not be unseen, and Nuo stood in front of the two women and said, in a voice that was the exact voice her father used when the matter was not open for discussion, "Ye Si Ming's place is with me. It has already been decided." The women looked at Consort Xiao. Consort Xiao looked at her daughter. She looked at the boy standing just behind Nuo, who had the expression of someone who had, somewhere in the last few minutes, made a decision he intended to keep. She said calmly, "You heard the princess. The matter is settled." The women left. Wan Yin from the doorway made a very small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. A week later, Nuo organized what she called an outing, which was her word for any situation where she brought multiple people to do something and expected it to go well. She brought the second prince, who came because he had nowhere else to be and snacks were implied. She brought the third prince, who came because Nuo had asked him, and he would have followed her into a burning building at this point and he knew it. And she brought Ye Si Ming, who was ostensibly there for her protection, and actually there because he was always there when she went anywhere. They ended up at a street market. The second prince was immediately distracted by a vendor selling something remarkable. The third prince found a stall of medicinal herbs and became absorbed. Nuo pulled Ye Si Ming through the crowd with her hand in his and pointed at every interesting thing with her free hand, narrating everything she saw in her small, enthusiastic voice. He followed her. He didn't know how else to be, around her. They saw a troubling scene in a quiet corner of the market. A young woman named Xiao He was standing under a tree weeping. A man, handsome, well-dressed, with the practiced smoothness of someone who had said persuasive things to many people over many years, was comforting her with the specific, performative tenderness of someone who was not particularly sincere about it. Nuo and Ye Si Ming, approaching from behind some stalls, caught enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. The man had apparently told Xiao He that their betrothal was merely a social formality, that his heart was entirely hers, and had done so in language so elaborately romantic that Xiao He had been thoroughly convinced. Then, seconds later, the man's actual intended, a young woman named Xiao Yue, appeared, and the man's entire manner changed. He explained away Xiao He with the ease of someone who had practiced this explanation. He told Xiao Yue that Xiao He was simply someone who had developed an inappropriate attachment that he had firmly discouraged. He took Xiao Yue's hand. He placed it against his heart. He said words that were structurally identical to the words he had said to Xiao He minutes earlier. Nuo watched all of this from behind a canvas stall curtain. She looked up at Ye Si Ming. He raised an eyebrow. She raised both of hers back. She stepped out from behind the curtain, crossed to where the three of them were standing, and said, in the cheerful, innocent tone that she deployed specifically when she intended to be extremely effective, "Hello? I heard everything that just happened. Both of them." She let that sit for a moment. Then to Xiao He, "He told you your engagement was for appearances, yes?" And then to Xiao Yue, "And he just told you that she made everything up. But that's not right. He said the same things to both of you. I was right there." The man, whose name turned out to be Jiang Zhan, which was a name Nuo filed away as useful, smiled at her with the polished patience of an adult addressing an interfering child. He said something dismissive about children who overheard conversations and misunderstood them. Then he reached out to move Nuo aside. Ye Si Ming's hand was around Jiang Zhan's wrist before it got anywhere near Nuo. The grip was not violent. It was precise. It communicated one message with clarity. This is the only warning. Jiang Zhan looked at the hand on his wrist. He looked at the person the hand belonged to. He made several rapid recalculations. A moment later he was no longer moving toward Nuo. Nuo, satisfied, looked at both young women. She said, "You should know what he actually said to each of you." She told them, accurately and in order, and watched their faces change. Xiao He and Xiao Yue looked at each other. They looked at Jiang Zhan. They made a unified and decisive assessment. Jiang Zhan, left alone in the corner of the market by two young women who had suddenly found much better uses for their afternoon, looked back at the small princess and the person standing behind her with the expression of someone processing a significant reversal of fortune. He said, "I know people, important people. You've made an enemy today, little girl." Ye Si Ming said nothing. He stepped forward once. Jiang Zhan stepped back twice. The interaction concluded. Nuo waved pleasantly at where Jiang Zhan's retreating figure was disappearing into the crowd. She said to no one in particular, "I hope the pond is not too cold." Ye Si Ming looked down at her. She looked up at him. He said, "You were hoping he'd end up in the pond, weren't you?" She said, "Big brother Si Ming, I would never." He did not believe her. She knew he didn't believe her. They walked back into the market to find the second and third princes. The sugar figure vendor Nuo had spotted earlier was still at his cart. She stopped in front of it with an expression that said everything. The figures were beautiful, painted in bright colors, twisted into the shapes of animals and flowers, and tiny people in miniature scenes. Ye Si Ming looked at them. He looked at Nuo's face. He reached into his sleeve and found what he was looking for, which was nothing, because he had forgotten entirely that he had no money. He stood there for a moment with his hand in his empty sleeve and a very specific expression. Nuo watched him. She had seen this expression before, usually immediately before something creative happened. He squared his shoulders and walked to where a crowd had gathered around a man demonstrating feats of strength. The kind of street performance where volunteers from the crowd could earn small prizes by matching the demonstrator's achievements. He scanned the situation. He rolled up his sleeve. He picked up the stone the demonstrator used. He held it for a moment. He put it down, picked up a larger one, and broke it. Not partially, completely. The demonstrator stared at the pieces. The crowd stared at Ye Si Ming. Someone dropped their food. Someone else started clapping and didn't stop. Ye Si Ming collected what was offered, came back to Nuo, bought her the sugar figure she had been looking at, and handed it to her as if none of the preceding events had been in any way unusual. Nuo held the sugar figure and looked at him with her whole heart in her face. She said, "You're the best." He said, "I know." He had never said anything like that in his life before, and they both knew it and neither of them said so. She laughed. a real bright whole laugh, and took his hand and pulled him to find the others, and he went, and the sugar figure was sweet, and the afternoon was warm, and somewhere across the city, Guo Bu Huan was being escorted by imperial guards toward a reckoning he had not expected, and the soldiers at the camp were drinking the medicine that worked, and the Empress was recovering in her chambers, and General Bai and his wife were sitting in their courtyard having evening tea, and conspicuously not discussing what they both already knew. And the great marshal was somewhere adding to the list of people he intended to personally thank for keeping his daughter safe. And the world was, for the moment, turning in a direction that felt like it had been arranged by someone who knew what they were doing. That night, Ye Si Ming sat on the roof of the general's residence, a habit he had of going up high when he needed to think, and looked at the city spread out below him. He stayed there for a long time. He thought about things that he had not thought about before, or had thought about and set aside, or had understood intellectually, without understanding in any way that mattered. He thought about a small person who had decided, at 3 years old, with no consultation and no hesitation, that he had a place and that the place was beside her. He thought about how she had walked into her mother's sitting room with him behind her and announced it to a room full of adults with the complete certainty of someone stating a fact that everyone else had simply not gotten around to acknowledging yet. He thought about how she had been right, how it had been true before she said it, how the saying of it had just made it visible. He looked at the city. He thought, I was found in a cage. I was found barefoot and cold and looked at through iron bars by a girl who offered me candy. I have spent the last 1.5 years sleeping in a warm house, eating regular meals, being given books and training grounds, and a name that people said without fear or contempt. I have been trusted with the most important person in this empire, and I have not failed that trust. I have held someone while they cried, and let them take my hair ornament, and chased a cat out of a tree and carried a child through rain, and built a fire and told a bear to cooperate and broken a stone for a sugar figure and stood in a room and said by being there, this is where I am. He thought, Yao Guang, the one who illuminates 10,000 things. He looked at the city lights below, each one a small warm point in the dark, and thought, I understand now why they gave her that name. And then he thought, I am going to be in trouble for a very long time, and I don't think I mind. He stayed on the roof until the stars shifted. Then he went back inside. In the morning, Nuo would have somewhere to go and would need an escort. She always did. He would be ready.